The strategy was simple, elegant even. Cut China off from advanced semiconductors, and within 18 months, their AI programs stall, their military modernization slows, and Beijing comes back to the table. That was the working assumption inside the Commerce Department when the October 2022 export controls went into full effect. Simple, elegant, wrong. Here's the number that should be hanging on a wall somewhere in Washington. $5.4 billion. That's the estimated value of advanced chips, Nvidia A100s, H100s, and their close relatives, that moved into China between the announcement of export restrictions and their enforcement. Not smuggled, not through gray markets, shipped, legally. Because the rules had a 28-day grace period, and 28 days is a long time when you know exactly what's coming. But that's not what should make you angry. Not yet. What should make you angry is that a working group inside the Chinese Academy of Sciences published an internal planning document in 2019, 3 years before those export controls, that outlined, with uncomfortable precision, the probable shape of an American semiconductor sanctions regime. It identified the likely trigger points. It modeled the grace period problem. It flagged advanced GPUs as the category most vulnerable to hoarding. And it recommended that Chinese state-linked entities begin systematic accumulation of foreign chips while access remained open. That document didn't leak by accident. Portions of it surfaced in Chinese academic and policy circles, translated into the kind of language that doesn't travel well into Western trade journals, which is probably why nobody in Washington treated it as what it was, a strategic preview. The October 2022 controls were designed to be a chokehold. China had spent 3 years building a stockpile specifically because they knew a chokehold was coming. There's a concept in chess called zugzwang, a position where every move available to you makes your situation worse. Washington's chip strategy didn't create zugzwang for Beijing. It walked into one. Every tightening of controls accelerated Chinese domestic investment. Every entity list addition told Chinese firms exactly which dependencies to eliminate. Every grace period became a procurement window. The Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security has expanded its chip-related restrictions 5 times since October 2022. Each announcement comes with a press release about closing loopholes. Each announcement is followed, within months, by evidence that the loopholes closed were not the loopholes being used. Nvidia's H800 chip, specifically architected to fall just below the export control threshold, shipped to China in volumes that made it, briefly, the most strategically significant piece of silicon on Earth. Then the threshold moved. So Nvidia drew up the H20. The threshold moved again. This isn't a sanctions regime. It's a product roadmap negotiation conducted through federal registers, and Beijing watched all of it, calmly, patiently, the way you watch something unfold that you already planned for. The stockpile strategy, the idea that accumulating restricted chips buys China time while Washington tightens the net, was supposed to be a temporary buffer, a few months of runway while Chinese firms scrambled for alternatives. Instead, it became something more uncomfortable, evidence that the adversary read the playbook before the playbook was written. We'll come back to that 2019 document, because the stockpile recommendation wasn't the most important thing in it. Let's talk about what predicting an American sanctions regime actually requires. It doesn't require spies. It doesn't require back channels or stolen memos. It requires reading the public record carefully, the think tank papers, the congressional testimony, the industry lobbying filings, and understanding that Washington telegraphs its strategic intentions loudly, repeatedly, and well in advance, because that's what open democracies do. China's planners didn't need to penetrate the Commerce Department. They needed a library card and the patience to use it. The 2019 working group document drew heavily on 3 publicly available sources: a 2018 Rand Corporation study on semiconductor supply chain vulnerabilities, a congressional testimony by former Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work on technology competition, and the entity listing of Fujian Jinhua, a Chinese memory chip maker sanctioned in 2018 for allegedly misappropriating Micron's trade secrets. That last one was the tell. Fujian Jinhua wasn't a major player. It was a test case. And Beijing's planners read it exactly that way. Washington was calibrating its tools, not deploying them at scale. Scale was coming. So the accumulation began. Not chaotically, methodically. Between 2019 and 2022, Chinese firms with state backing, including entities connected to the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, known as the Big Fund, quietly expanded procurement of foreign advanced chips at a rate that didn't trigger any of the monitoring thresholds in place at the time. The purchases were distributed across enough intermediary entities to avoid concentration flags. Some moved through Singapore, some through Taiwan-based distributors, some through wholly legitimate commercial channels that nobody thought to scrutinize because the controls didn't exist yet. By the time October 2022 arrived, estimates from the Rhodium Group and the Center for Strategic and International Studies suggested Chinese firms held somewhere between 18 and 24 months of advanced GPU inventory, for AI training workloads specifically. That's not a buffer. That's a runway long enough to build a domestic alternative, which is exactly what happened. And this is the part where the anger should shift direction slightly, because it's not just about what China did. It's about what American policymakers chose not to see. The Semiconductor Industry Association warned the Commerce Department in early 2022, before the October controls, that an abrupt, unilateral export restriction without allied coordination would accelerate, not retard, Chinese domestic semiconductor investment. The warning was specific. If Chinese firms believed access would eventually be cut entirely, the rational response was not dependence on workarounds, but elimination of the dependency altogether. You don't sanction a country into reliance. You sanction them into self-sufficiency. That warning didn't get ignored because it was obscure. It was submitted as formal public comment during the rulemaking process. It's in the federal record. You can read it today. The response from policymakers, reconstructed from subsequent interviews and congressional testimony, was roughly, "We understand the concern, but the urgency of the strategic moment outweighs the transition risk. Move fast, tighten later. Move fast, tighten later." Applied to semiconductor policy. Against a country that had been planning for this moment for 3 years. There's a specific irony lodged inside SMIC's N+2 process node, the 7-nanometer equivalent chip that SMIC, China's largest domestic foundry, quietly produced in 2022 using equipment it already had, pushing that equipment past its rated specifications through a process engineers call multi-patterning. The chip appeared inside a Huawei Mate 60 Pro in August 2023. The phone went on sale without a press conference, without an announcement. Huawei just put it on shelves. Washington found out the way everyone else did, a teardown posted online. The chip wasn't as efficient as TSMC's equivalent. The yield rates were lower. The cost per unit was higher. None of that mattered. What mattered was proof that the ceiling Washington thought it had installed wasn't a ceiling. Remember the 2019 document's Stockpile recommendation? The one I said wasn't the most important thing in it? Here's what was. A parallel track. While stockpiling foreign chips to buy time, simultaneously fund domestic process development without regard for near-term profitability. Absorb the inefficiency. Accept the cost premium. Treat the capability gap as a temporary problem rather than a permanent constraint. The Mate 60 Pro was that parallel track, arriving on schedule. Now let me complicate my own argument, because it deserves it. There's a version of this story where Washington's strategy wasn't naive. It was calculated at a different timescale. The argument goes like this. Yes, China stockpiled. Yes, SMIC produced a 7-nanometer equivalent chip. But SMIC can't produce that chip at scale. Yield rates at advanced nodes require not just the process knowledge, but the full ecosystem. The photoresist chemists, the metrology equipment, the defect inspection tools, the supply chain redundancy that TSMC spent 4 decades building in a 30-kilometer radius in Hsinchu. China doesn't have that ecosystem. The stockpile buys 18 months. The domestic capability buys a demonstration. Neither buys a production-grade advanced semiconductor industry. That argument is not wrong. It's incomplete. Here's where the incompleteness lives. The export controls weren't designed to stop China from making chips. They were designed to stop China from making enough chips, fast enough, to close the AI capability gap before American firms consolidated an insurmountable lead. That's a timing bet. And timing bets require you to correctly estimate your opponent's clock speed. Washington estimated China's path to meaningful domestic advanced chip production at somewhere between 8 and 12 years in 2022. That estimate came from reasonable assumptions about equipment access, talent pipelines, and process development timelines. It did not fully account for what happens when a government treats semiconductor self-sufficiency as a regime-level priority rather than an industrial policy goal. The distinction matters. Industrial policy goals get balanced against other budget priorities. Regime-level priorities do not. Between 2022 and 2024, China's central and provincial governments directed an estimated $143 billion towards semiconductor-related investment, manufacturing, materials, equipment, and design tools. That figure comes from analysis by the Semiconductor Industry Association, cross-referenced with Chinese budget disclosures. To put it in scale, the entire U.S. CHIPS Act allocated $52 billion over 5 years. China deployed nearly 3 times that in 2 years, and that's only the disclosed portion. The 8 to 12-year timeline started compressing. Not collapsing, compressing. That's an important distinction. SMIC is not TSMC. Huawei's Kirin 9010 chip, impressive as a proof of concept, runs hotter and less efficiently than Qualcomm's equivalent. Chinese EDA software, the design tools that underpin chip architecture, remains years behind Synopsys and Cadence. These are real gaps. Anyone telling you China has solved its semiconductor problem is selling you something. But here's the reversal. The export control strategy was premised on a stable definition of advanced. Advanced meant sub-7 nanometer. It meant the leading edge. It meant the chips required for frontier AI training. The H100 class hardware that runs the models that matter. Control that category, the logic went, and you control the capability trajectory. What nobody modeled carefully enough was that the definition of advanced is not stable. It moves. And it moves faster when the people being excluded are highly motivated to move it. Huawei's CloudMatrix 384 system, announced in 2025, doesn't beat Nvidia's GB200 NVLink rack on raw per-chip performance. It doesn't need to. It uses a different architecture, more chips, more interconnects, optimized for the specific workloads Chinese AI labs are actually running. The benchmark that matters isn't peak teraflops, it's cost per useful inference on a Chinese language model trained on Chinese data for Chinese deployment. On that benchmark, the gap looks different. This is what the 2019 planning document understood, and Washington's export control architecture didn't. You don't win a technology race by defining the track. You win by being faster on whatever track actually gets run. The controls defined a track. China is building a different one. And the stockpile, those 18 to 24 months of Nvidia A100s and H100s acquired before the gates closed, funded the research that designed the detour. The irony is almost architectural. American chips, purchased before American sanctions, paid for the work that makes American sanctions increasingly beside the point. There's one more thread here that doesn't get enough attention. The export controls accelerated something in the global south that Washington genuinely did not intend. They reframed the entire question of AI infrastructure access as a geopolitical alignment choice. Countries in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa that might have defaulted to American cloud infrastructure are now receiving direct pitches from Huawei and Alibaba Cloud, backed by hardware that's sanctions-proof by design. The controls meant to isolate China quietly handed Beijing a sales proposition that no American firm can currently match. We will never cut you off. That's not a technology story, that's a market structure story, and it was not in the impact assessment. So where does that leave us? Not with a clean verdict. With something more uncomfortable, a strategy that was directionally understandable, operationally sloppy, and structurally outmaneuvered by an adversary that had years to study it before it arrived. The anger isn't that Washington tried. The anger is that the warnings were there, filed in public records, submitted through proper channels, written in plain English by people whose job was to know exactly this, and the response was to move fast anyway. There's a particular kind of institutional failure that doesn't look like failure from the inside. It looks like decisiveness. It looks like finally doing something after years of watching China accumulate advantages while Washington debated. The October 2022 controls felt like action. They were action, but action designed around a model of the adversary that the adversary had already invalidated. Go back to the opening. The strategy was simple, elegant. Cut off access, watch the clock run down, negotiate from strength. That mental model assumes a passive recipient, a China that responds to the moves Washington makes rather than one that already mapped the decision tree and positioned accordingly. The 2019 document didn't just predict the sanctions, it predicted that American policymakers would underestimate the stockpile window, overestimate the timeline to domestic production, and fail to coordinate with allies fast enough to close the gray market routes. 3 predictions, 3 accurate ones. The ally coordination failure deserves its own script, and it'll get one. But briefly, the Netherlands, home to ASML, the only company on Earth that builds the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines required for leading-edge chip production, didn't fully align with American export restrictions until January 2024. 15 months after the U.S. controls went into effect, 15 months during which ASML continued servicing existing equipment inside Chinese fabs. Equipment that, once installed and calibrated, doesn't need the manufacturer present to keep running. The Biden administration knew this. The gap was documented. The diplomatic pressure on The Hague was real, but slow. And slow, in semiconductor policy, is a unit of measurement that translates directly into Chinese production capability. Here is my read on where this ends up, not as scenario planning, as an actual prediction I'll stand behind. The export control architecture will continue tightening. The entity lists will grow. The ally coordination will improve, incrementally, because the strategic logic is sound even if the execution has been ragged. And none of it will restore the leverage position that existed in 2020, before the stockpile was built, before SMIC proved the process node, before Huawei reframed the Global South pitch. That window closed. It closed partly because of bad timing, partly because of institutional inertia, and partly because Washington kept broadcasting its intentions to an adversary that was listening more carefully than anyone wanted to admit. China will not achieve full semiconductor self-sufficiency in 5 years. Probably not in 10. The ecosystem gap is real, and it compounds. But full self-sufficiency was never the goal. The goal, China's goal, the one documented in 2019, was sufficiency for the specific applications that matter most to regime security and military capability. Domestic AI training infrastructure, secure communications hardware, guidance systems. You don't need TSMC-grade yields to hit those targets. You need good enough, at scale, without foreign dependencies that can be switched off. That bar is lower than the one Washington was measuring against, and it is closer to being cleared than the public conversation currently acknowledges. The last thing worth sitting with. Somewhere in a policy planning office in Beijing, there is almost certainly a document written in the last 2 years that models the next American move. It identifies the likely trigger. It recommends the countermeasure. It will surface, in fragments, in academic journals that don't get read by the people who need to read them. Washington will call it unexpected when it lands. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, the stuff that lives between the press release and the actual story, share it with someone who's tired of getting the headline version. That's the only ask.